Hello and welcome back to my Stevenson Weekender Sailboat build. In this episode I'm going to build the steering wheel for the boat. Rather than a more traditional tiller style steering, the plans call for this wheel to help save room in the cockpit. I will note that the plans called for building the wheel out of flat 3/4 inch stock and then using a router to round the edges, but I decided to turn it on a lathe. I've never used a wood lathe before, so this was all new to me. But I started by creating a full-size template on paper and then would use that on this first attempt to turn the blank down to those dimensions. I do think this first attempt turned out fairly well and was a close approximation of the template I had drawn, but I realized fairly quickly that I do not think I had the skill to turn 6 of these and have them be anywhere close to identical. So I decided to throw together a duplicator from my lathe. This will allow me to use a template to create 6 identical spokes for the wheel. Here I'm just attaching a base that the follower will travel on as it follows the template. Next I'll create the carriage that the bit and follower tooth will be attached to. Stick with me here, this will all make more sense once it's assembled and I'll show you how it works. I'm going to make the cutting part of this duplicator out of this old circle saw blade. Now that the cutting bit is attached to the carriage, I'm going to make the follower that's going to track along the template out of this old piece of scrap metal. So here you can see that the bit is lined up just slightly behind the tip of the follower. And with the duplicator finished, I'll move on to making the template. I took the full-size drawing that I'd made on the computer and glued it to this piece of 1/2 inch MDF. Here I'm just attaching some spacer blocks so that the template will end up at the right height for the follower on the carriage. So with everything screwed down and ready, you can see in this close-up how the follower piece will track along the template. So now we'll get a blank chucked up and try this thing out. My method here was to move the carriage in perpendicular to the template to cut those square shoulders, and then I'd move on to cutting the round parts. I did have to move my follower in just a little bit because the initial setup wasn't cutting the square edges off the round parts completely. But once I had it dialed in, it did a pretty good job. Once I had a system going, I found I could turn one of these out about once every 10 minutes, and they were much closer to identical than I ever could have gotten trying to do this by hand. Once I had the 6 spokes made, I had to get them put together in a ring. So each spoke had to be cut so that the tip ended up with a 60-degree angle. So now that the spokes were finished, I could move on to working on the connector rings. To accomplish this, I needed a circle cutting jig. This simply consisted of a piece of scrap plywood bolted down to my router table with a small nail as a pivot point. I would spin the board around that nail pivot point while I slowly raised the router bit. Once the outer diameter was cut, I could move the pivot point in a little to cut the inner diameter. And here I'm finishing a second ring that'll be a piece of decorative trim, as you'll see in a minute. After the rings were cut, I used this 1/4 inch roundover bit to round over the inner and outer edges. I needed to take the smaller inner ring from a 3/4 inch thickness down to a 1/4 inch thickness. So I used one of these offcuts as somewhat of a carriage to rest the ring against. The fence set the proper distance from the blade and then ran that offcut through until it was in about the right position. Then lowered the blade and got the ring pressed up against the fence with this featherboard. And then turned the saw back on and was able to slowly raise the blade until it was through the inner diameter of the ring, and then used my hand well away from the blade to spin the ring around to cut the 1/4 inch piece off of it. Now I'll get the spokes permanently glued together. I use these hose clamps to provide some pressure while the glue set. But once the glue was dry, I removed the clamps and then laid out the spokes on the ring so that I could get that marked out for cutting. I wanted the main ring and this decorative ring to be cut at the same time so that they'd match up better. So here I'm getting everything lined up and then going to place some pin nails. I only placed the pin nails in sections that would be cut away, but as I made my final cuts I didn't want the loose piece of the decorative ring flying apart, so I used this tape to attach the rings together in between the pin nails. Then I just used the sled on the table saw to cut the individual sections apart. Here you can see that once these sections were cut, I was able to remove that tape, and that portion of the decorative ring was easy to remove. I made sure I numbered everything so I could get them back in the same place they were. This is a pocket hole jig that I'm going to use to attach the rings to the spokes. So you can see here now why I need that decorative ring to cover the pocket holes. So once I had all the pocket holes cut in, I used some Type Bond 3 to get them permanently put in place against the spokes. That small triangle of plywood and those two washers are just there to act as spacers. So once the screws were all in place, I could use some more glue and pin nails to permanently place those decorative pieces and hide those holes. Here's how it's going to look on the boat. You also get a sneak peek of the primer that I've got on the boat already. That and the boat paint will be coming up in another video soon. That little black piece of trim was 3D printed by a friend of mine. Overall, I'm very pleased with how this turned out. I think it adds a lot to the look of the boat. In the next video, I think I'll show the painting of the boat and the spars, but I think I'll end this video here. As always, if you enjoyed this, please subscribe and leave a like. And I hope you'll join me next time as we continue to build the Stevenson Weekender Sailboat.